Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. My name is Niels, an environment artist at Sierra Division, and in this part, we'll be covering texturing. For me, texturing is the most rewarding process of the pipeline, as you will see your baked model and the model that you worked on for so long finally come to life with realistic textures. And that's what we're trying to do in this part of the tutorial, is to teach you a thing or two on how to make your model a tad bit more interesting. So let's jump straight into Substance Painter. You probably already know the drill. You load in your model and you load up your mesh maps inside of the texture set settings. And first things first, we're gonna set up our environment just a little bit. What I usually like to do is click on a nice environment map. This could be any. Usually I like to use one that's a bit desaturated, so you can use Tomoko Studio, for example. There's also a Tomoko Studio desaturated that works pretty well. And once you have that loaded up, we can then set up the camera. I like to work in orthographic. It's something from Fusion. I don't know why. I just like orthographic. It makes me see stuff just a little bit better. Then you can press on post settings and post effects and click on tone mapping, and you want to put it on log. Then all you have to do is click on activate temporal AA and activate a color profile. This one is called ACES UE4 log, so it works with the log tone mapping. Other than that, you can select some stuff that you want, like you can set your grid and make it a different color maybe. But that's pretty much it. And if you want some more quality on your model in Substance Painter viewport, you can set the specular quality a bit higher. But that's pretty much it. We're ready to texture now. So I got my model loaded up here and all the texture sets are in. The first thing that I like to do to make it a little bit easier is that I make masks. As you can see here, I have some masks and these have no information whatsoever. So they're just empty layers. No color, no information at all. And the reason why I like to do it is because I usually bake my ID map with the meshes, and every time you rebake, like you see an error or something and you rebake, the color ID is always random. So if you do a color selection and you select, for example, the main body, but then your ID map changes because you rebaked or added parts to your UV, it'll update that ID map. So your mask won't be correct anymore. So one way that I like to do is just create my mask manually, like here. Sometimes I use a color selection if I know I won't have to rebake, but usually I just like to paint stuff in manually, and I use this by clicking this little button here. It'll fill it with either your triangles, polygons, elements, or your UV maps. So that will never change. Your masks will stay the same throughout your process, even if you rebake your maps. So after that, I name it and I put up a anchor point so I can easily use it on different layers. And I do this for pretty much everything in the scene, or I just create new ones whenever I want to. So once you have that set up, we can go and create the main body. So the main body, let's take a look at some references here. The main body, there's some different types of bodies here. You have the older one, it's a little bit darker, a little bit more brownish, and then you have this part right here. This is the probably newer version, as you can see on the knobs, a little bit more desaturated. So we're just gonna recreate maybe a combination of both. It doesn't really have to be 100% correct, but we should get going on setting up the base. So I already have a folder right here called Painted Metal, and I already made some base materials for the main body, but I'll just go over them one by one. So first up is the base color. What you can do if you have a nice little reference image, let's just hide this one and create quickly a anchor point for the painted metal mask so we can start from scratch. Let's call it P2, add a black mask, and then you would just basically do your fill layer with the anchor point or the mask you created here, and we'll find this one. All right, awesome. So we can hide it right now. The first thing we want to do is establish the very base. So this will be our color. As you can see here, only the main body changes. But of course, we don't want this model, or this color rather. So we're just going to go ahead and look at some ref. And one thing we can do is just pick the color from a ref image. Decent color. We can always tweak it. So if you want to tweak it easily without having to color pick different elements, one thing you could do is add a filter, and you add a HSL, so hue, saturation, and levels, or lightness rather. And then you can kind of change it up, maybe desaturate it just a tad, make it a little bit lighter and darker. It's just all up to personal preference. So that's pretty much it for the base. The painted mask is not metal, so we put the metal to 0, and the roughness, we'll play around with it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So one thing I want to establish early on is some color variation. So if you look at the base color map, it's just flat, and that's pretty boring. We usually always want to break up the surface just a little bit. Even if it's just for color or roughness, you usually want to break it up just a tad. So what I like to do to break it up just a little bit, it doesn't have to be super intense, like contrasty. For example, if we look at the other layer, we can see if we disable some parts here that the color variation is very subtle, but it's a lot more interesting than this one, for example. So one way I like to do it is either put up a color and then usually put it on multiply or subtract it. But let's just disable everything for now and add a filter called HSL again. And we're going to be working with HSL a lot. Other useful filters are color correction or color balance, but I don't think we'll use that one. And after that, when you create your layer, you can put it to pass through. And what this will do is affect every layer under this layer in the same folder. Okay. So when you, for example, have this part and you desaturate it, it will affect every single layer. So if we add another layer, and we have a black mask and we do a little painty paint on it, there we go, and then we change the hue, it'll affect every layer under it, only in the same folder. It won't affect this folder. So we can just delete this one and obviously kind of reset it to 0.5 because you don't really want to change the hue. But stuff like this, putting a color layer to pass through, is good for overall look development. So what we want to do is kind of, before we add a mask, is to either change up the lightness a bit, like make it a little bit darker, maybe desaturate it just a tad, and then we want to add some simple grunge maps. So you can play around with it just a little bit, add a fill layer to it, and look for some grunge. Then you can search for a grunge image that you like most. Doesn't even have to be metal. You can even just type in paper, and of course set it to triplanar, and maybe change the tiling just a little bit. And you already have some base variation. This might be just a little too much, but then you can start building your masks. So you can do a noise, and you can kind of break it up just a little bit. So you can change the scale, make it bigger, and then you can either set it to multiply. If we alt click on the mask, it'll preview it, multiply it, or subtract from it, something like that. So if you don't really want the grunge paper, you can just change it to a different grunge. So I'll be looking for something that suits the model just a little bit more, and that'll give me a little bit more breakup. So found a pretty cool grunge map. It's called Grunge Galvanic Large, and of course we want to break that up just a tad. So we're just going to add a filter, and it's called non-uniform blur, and it is available to download, which will be linked below, thanks to our colleague Doru. It's a filter he made. One of the quirks that I'll show you right now that the filter has is it'll create some seams on the UV islands. So we just want to tweak this filter first, have it a little bit more variation, for example like this, and all you have to do is go to filter and add a blur to it. You don't even have to crank up the blur, you can just leave it at a very low value or even 0, and for some reason that'll fix the seam issue. You'll have a little seam here, but you can just duplicate that blur, and blur it out just a little amount so it becomes less visible. But because this is just for minimal breakup on the base albedo, you won't really notice any issues with it anyways. So now what we see is it's mainly white, and if we enable and disable the layer, we can see it mainly turns our model a bit darker. So we want to kind of invert it by doing a levels and clicking invert. Now you can see we have some breakup on the surface already, and it looks a bit more interesting than just a flat surface. We have some nice variation already, and we can start adding some more. Now there's not really a rule of thumb how many layers you can add to your base, but just don't go super crazy and make it super noticeable. You don't want any base material or base albedo breakup that kind of looks like this. This is way too much. It needs to be very subtle. So maybe you can just duplicate that layer, or if you want some base roughness variation in there already, you can kind of crank it up like so. Then you can duplicate the layer and disable everything that you need, and you can continue making new masks to continue breaking up the surface. Now this is not the only way to break up a base albedo. You can always add a white mask, for example, now, and we're going to put in just a texture that we downloaded from somewhere. It could either be Bridge or Textures, doesn't really matter, or something that you made yourself, of course. So let's say you have just a random texture, and it doesn't even have to be metal. As long as it has some breakup, you can just add it to your model. For example, we have some concrete textures over here, and we can just slap it on the base color. Of course, that's not what we want. We want to edit that just a little bit, or it might not even work for what we want. You don't know, you just have to keep on trying. That's part of texturing. You just keep on trying different things, deleting and removing, and then if you're happy with it, you just keep it. So even here on the base layer, not on the mask, we can add a filter. The same thing, we can just add a non-uniform blur, and it'll be kind of like this again. So instead of replace, we can put it to multiply, for example, or something that will give us some cool breakup here on the edges. Now, of course, the color is not really what we want right now. This is not something that we're looking for. It's way too noisy, and it's not even correct. So what we change is the blending mode here on the base color layer, and maybe put it to multiply or something, and then drag the stuff way down. Let's see how it looks on overlay. You can kind of play around with it. It's your playground, as I said. So if you're happy with that, let's say you want this kind of breakup on the base model, you can just leave it like this. So of course you would name your layers, call it base, and then breakup darker big, for example, and then you would call this one as well. Just make sure your layers are easily recognizable for maybe someone else looking into your Substance Painter file, and it's easier for them to recognize what's what. Alright, so I just added a edge breakup, and it'll make the edges just a tad bit lighter right here. Nothing too crazy, but I think we're already at a pretty good spot to continue moving on to the different layers. The next thing we'll do is just add all the details like we have here. Some of the height, as we can see here, some squares, maybe the arrow. We have some of the squiggly lines here, and that's part of the bigger breakup. So we're going to do that first, and then we can start focusing on adding smaller details, such as this grime or dirt in between the cracks, and some overall more dirt and grime in between the squares, and just kind of refine it just a little bit. So what we're going to be focusing on for the body are these squiggly lines. You could try to do it procedurally inside of Substance by either using like a plasma texture that you modify just a bit, or what I did was just take a screenshot of the model, and you would just take a screenshot just like this and copy and paste it into Photoshop, and then you had something like this. Of course, you would want to edit the parts where it is way lighter up top here as compared to where it's darker. So the first thing we're going to do is actually make it tile. So this image is 600 by 600. What we want to do is go to Filter, Other, and then click Offset. And then you want to put 300 and 300. What that will do is take the halves and just kind of make a little seam here. And you always want to do half of the image that you have. So if your image is 1024, then you would do plus 512 and 512 vertical. You just want to click OK. And the next step you want to do is maybe create a new layer. Select the stamp tool and make sure it samples from the current and below. Then you just want to stamp in some parts here and there. Maybe tone down the hardness just a tad. Sample it from somewhere else so we don't get that seam. And you basically want to paint out the hard edge that we have here. And you want to go across the entire thing. Now, if you're happy with it, of course, I won't go ahead and do everything. You can start adding levels to it. But first you might want to desaturate it just a tad. And then you can start adding a level. So you can play around with the levels until you get like some kind of texture that you find interesting to use. So for example, this was the texture that I used with some levels. And what you want to do next is you don't want the insides, which are now white, you want the outside, the black parts, to be white. So what we're going to do is just add an invert, and there we go. That's our texture that we're going to be using. Of course, this is very low res, but we're going to tile it a ton anyways, so it doesn't really matter. So we're going back to Painter right now, and we're going to add the first height layer to it. We're going to create a new layer and deselect everything but height. Then we're going to give it a height value, and we're not going to touch any of these parts just yet. We're going to add a black mask, and then we're going to look for the acid that you would have imported into your shelf. So we have the squiggly lines here. We're just going to add a quick fill to it, and we're going to drag it in here. So after that, you would do a triplanar and scale it down just a tad. You want to look at some ref to see how big it actually is. So just change the tiling until you're happy with it, until it matches the ref quite a bit. So once you're happy with the tiling, you look at ref, we kind of want to tweak the mask just a tad. So we're going to alt click the mask and maybe add a histogram scan and change up the contrast a little bit, maybe the position, and you want to check it out on your model as well to see what looks best. So I'm not sure if I want to change a whole lot. I still want it to be quite round. So I don't think we changed that much by adding it, but you can always add it just to have some little more control over how you want your height to be. So now it's pretty even overall. We kind of want to break it up again. So we already know that we can just easily break it up by either adding a grunge or noise and changing the scale just a bit. We're going to preview the mask, change the scale. I want it quite a bit larger to have some larger breakup. Let's try to put it like this. And of course we want to put it to subtract, for example. And then we can check out the material. That's kind of rough, so we can just easily adjust the opacity of the mask. And we can already see there's quite a big difference. It's not equal overall. There's a little bit of breakup to it. And you can edit the mask accordingly, add more filters, add more grunges. For example, maybe if you looked at the reference, you can see that on the edges here, there's not as much detail on there. Not sure if you see it on DiffSeref, but kind of makes sense that on the edges it kind of fades away. So we can get the same thinking by just adding a generator and going for curvature. So what we do next, again, we already learned, put it to subtract, but of course we want to kind of edit the curvature. Maybe just a tad so it doesn't show the UV seam. Drag down the fine and we can kind of blur it out to see how that looks. Maybe change the contrast a bit and just tweak it until you have something that looks nice to subtract it from the original mask. So once you're happy with it, you can just put it to subtract, maybe tone down the opacity as well. Then you can see on the edges it doesn't show as much detail as now. Of course, if you look at the tiling for the model, you can see some hard edges here. And that's because in the Photoshop file, we still had some light areas. We didn't take away the light from the picture. So you want to do that first as well before actually committing to it. But for now, I'm just going to leave it as is. So that's our main height to it. Now, the height, as you can see on the references, where we have the squares, it's not as visible. It's not as harsh or contrasty, but it's still kind of there. So we're going to add a paint layer and decrease the intensity for that part just a little bit. So how we're going to do that is we're going to add a paint to this one and go ahead and select your UV island, since this is one UV island, and just kind of drag it out. And then of course you can change the opacity for that layer as well. So that looks pretty fine. We can just do the same thing for this part as well, but you would have to kind of paint it in manually. So the next thing we want to do is we want it to have the same color as our base. Reason being is that if you want to add some dirt to it, it will be under inside of the crevices without having to do an extra work for the masks. So what we can do is, instead of just color picking, that wouldn't be viable since we would change the color and then it wouldn't change on this layer. So we can just come back to our base layer, add an anchor point and just call it base albedo, for example. And then in this color slot, you can add the base albedo to it. And that's that. You can always tweak it just a little bit as well, but that's it. The only thing that's left to do is create the name. We call it height, squiggly. You can just call it whatever you want. You don't have to do it 100% like I do. And then we're just creating an anchor point, so we can refer to other layer masks as well. I'll just show you an example why exactly we put it to a color. Let's say you want some dirt inside of the crevices, but not really on the top of them. If you add a dirt layer, let me just add a paint layer under the squiggly lines, for example. We have some white dirt. Dirt isn't really white, but we're just going to go for it anyways. And you want to add a paint layer. If you kind of paint in, you can see the albedo, the color, still has the squiggly lines as a color. So if we wouldn't have that color, it would just be white overall, and that wouldn't be super realistic. That way we can add some dirt without having to do fancy masks and subtracting the height from it, but that's just an easy way. Awesome. The next detail we're going to get in is the little squares over here. This should be fairly simple by just creating another mask, and we're just going to keep it at height for now. Then we're going to go get a black mask, set up the height to something negative probably, since it's kind of inset. Then we're just going to add a fill layer and go for a tile generator. There we go. Now, if we put the tile generator on top of the model, so let's do triplanar, scale down the scaling or the tiling, you'll see that it goes all over our model and it kind of looks like a waffle right now, which is kind of cool, but we don't really want that. We want it to be only on the part that we paint in. So let's go for that. Alt click the mask and go for the UV island. And you would want to paint in this area here as well. But let's just focus on one side. Now we put on our tile generator again, and if we put it to multiply, it'll only show up on the part that's painted on this paint layer here. If you look at the ref again, you can see that it goes kind of sideways. It has a 45-degree angle, so we can just easily scale it down or rotate the mask 45 degrees on the tile generator. So let's try to do it like a 45-degree angle. And that should be pretty good. We can decrease the tiling just a bit. Check out some ref. There's quite a lot of them. I think this might be fine actually. And what we want, as you can see, it kind of goes, it's kind of beveled here. It doesn't go straight down like a cube, but it kind of goes like this thing, if that kind of makes sense. My drawing skills aren't perfect, but you get the point. What we can do is just add a filter and go over to bevel. And let's check it out. Let's preview the mask. We can change the distance just a bit. Then change the smoothing. And let's check it out again. Now it isn't super harsh, but you might want to change up your tile generator a bit, change the pattern, change the scale, and maybe the offset for some parts. So just tweak it a bit until you get the exact part as the reference. So after playing around with the mask a little bit, this is what I've come up with to get a better result. So the only thing I changed probably was the offset and change it a little bit to make the lines a bit thinner, so it would work better for our bevel, so the distance and the smoothing. When we just go to our model again, you can see it kind of looks like the ref. Now, the only thing we want to do is call it height underscore square. And I like to call my layers sometimes when I don't forget, like h underscore, to make sure I know it's a height. And then what you want to do is just add another anchor point, and that's done. Sweet. Now we already have a pretty good base established with already some color variations to it. So it's time for us to start utilizing the anchor points that we made. So let's say you want some dirt inside of these crevices here, inside of the insets. So you would just create a new layer, make it a little bit rough, change up the color a tad, maybe just a little bit darker. And then you want to add a black mask, a fill layer with referencing the anchor point that we made here. And then you can see if you preview the mask, it only shows up on the squares that we have. Now, if we add, for example, a dirt or a grunge, let's just pick this one, put a triplanar, kind of scale it down, make it a little bit smaller. You can see we have some nice spots going here and there. You can, of course, change up the mask, so please change the mask. I'm just doing the basics here, but you can just create your own custom mask. And what we want to do next is put it to multiply, so it only shows up on the spots that we want. So if we drag the color, make it a little bit darker, we can see that we have some nice details, some color variations inside of the crevices, which is how it would be in real life. The dirt would collect inside, since it can't really go out. And then you would just create new masks every time. You don't really have to add fill layers. You can just add generators, for example, ambient occlusion. If you want it to show up on certain parts, then you would invert it and multiply it again. And then you would have some variation here if you disable this one. And change down the balance, contrast a tad. There you go. You have some occlusion, dirt. You can even use it with this mask if you want it to show up a little bit more on the edges. There's so much freedom you can do with anchor points, and I would highly advise you to start using them. So just go ahead and build up a little bit of the dirt here and there, make it nice and varied, and add some different colors, some different masks, and we'll be focusing on something else now, these squiggly lines. So the first thing we're going to do when we look at the squiggly lines is there's kind of rougher parts inside of the crevices here, so the negative parts. So we're going to try to get that in first before building up on the squiggly lines. So you want to name the masks, of course, but this is just an example. So we're going to just change the roughness. Maybe we can add color later, but I just want it to be a bit rougher. So what we want to do is add a black mask again, go to fill, add in the anchor point of your pattern, the squiggly lines that we just made, and it will show up on the extruded parts, but we want it to show up on the black parts, so go to levels and just invert them. Then you can go ahead and start playing with them just a little bit more. Drag it out, and that should be pretty good. Of course, then we don't want it to be rough everywhere. We just kind of want it to be spread out, maybe some parts only. So we can just go ahead and add some more grunge maps to it and build up the masks again. Let's try to just add a simple noise, for example, just to keep it simple. And drag out the scale, just like so. Then we can just put it to subtract, and you can see it's not overall everywhere. So it'll make some parts a bit more rough on the insides. So you have a little bit more variation, as you can see here. It breaks up the surface even more from a distance. And you can always put a color to it. So if you put color, you can make it a little bit darker by putting a light color and putting it to multiply. So if you look from a distance, you can see there's a nice breakup already. Now you could do the same thing, but instead of the insides of the squiggly lines, so the negative parts, you can start making some of the outer parts of the squiggly lines a bit darker. So then you would do the same thing, but you actually wouldn't just invert it. You would keep it as is and start breaking that up as well. The next part we're gonna see is the darker or the kind of grime spots right here on the edges and on the sides as well. If you look at the ref, there's some of these spots pretty much around the model, and there's some breakup in there as well, some darker spots, and kind of goes to light on the edges as well. See, there's some light on the inside, some dark on the outside, so let's get that in as well. So for the grime part, we're actually gonna need 2 layers, but let's start up with the main mask to do it first. So we're gonna create a new mask, and we're just gonna focus on color right now. We're not gonna worry about anything else. So for the color, what I'm gonna do is just simply color pick from the model. So I'm gonna find a color that doesn't look too saturated or dark. So let's try to find it real quick. All right, I found something. And we want to do the dark part first, and then we're gonna focus on kind of the lighter inside, or some parts that are kind of lighter. So let's do the first dark part and just keep the roughness as is. Gonna add a black mask again and just call it squiggly grime. Some decent naming conventions here. So let's just add a fill layer and use the same anchor point that we created. So the squiggly line mask, and we're gonna invert it again to only show up on the insides. Now, technically, you could have done the inside mask here if you wanted to have a little bit more control, or just want to make it more easier for you if you want to change it up, but we're just going to keep it a little bit like this and added levels for a bit more control, because I don't really want it exactly the same like we had the negative parts. I kind of want to have it on certain spots only. So that looks kind of good for me now at this point. I can always change it up real quick by changing the levels. So the grime, I'll just call it grime, only kind of shows up on the edges. It doesn't really show up on the main body anywhere. So as you can see here, on the edges here, there's some parts here as well on the thin parts. So let's just only make sure it's visible on the edge parts. So we're gonna add it. We're gonna add in a generator and go to curvature again. So when we preview the mask, we can see this just by adding the base curvature, we already have some nice spots here, but we can just kind of tone it down. We don't really want it to show up on the big parts, so to kind of drag it out or change the balance. Kind of want it blurred out just a tad, and then just multiply it. So that way it'll only show up on the edges. Of course, you want to change it up just quite a bit, so it's not only here and there. And then if you want, you can just add in a noise as well, so just to break it up just a little bit. So I just added a quick simplex noise to it, and instead of changing the levels here, I just changed the levels on this part here to make it a little bit more organized. And the curvature, it doesn't really show up that much, so before adding the simplex noise to subtract, I'm just going to add a quick levels, kind of make the white parts wider. Might be something like this, could be handy and nice, and then we can just subtract from it. So I think this is pretty nice. Let's take a look at it. And we can see it already start to show up on some parts of the model. We can of course tweak it a little bit if you want it to show up more here. Then feel free to just go ahead and change whatever. So next thing, if the mask doesn't really show what you want it, just feel free to hand paint in the stuff your own, just by doing some kind of squiggly stuff and basically stuff like this. Then you want it, and then you have it kind of hand painted and a bit more detailed than if you wouldn't have a pure mask. Now if we take a look at the grime mask, if we hand paint, we can see that it's kind of painting over the extruded parts, and we don't really want to have it on the extruded parts, so we're going to duplicate our mask and drag it all the way up top. And instead of putting it to normal, we're just going to put it to subtract. So let's see what result that gives us. So let's enable and disable. So it subtracts the extruded, so the high part, away from the painted part. So you can always change it if you want it a bit more organized, like so. So let's try to visualize it for you. There we go. So that way, if you hand paint it, it'll only be inside of your squiggly dark parts. Nice. So if you want, just go ahead and paint it, change up your mask a bit to make it a bit more like the reference. But for now, we're happy with it, and we're going to add an anchor point. I'm going to call it Squiggly Grime Mask, and we're going to focus on the lighter interiors. So go ahead and maybe duplicate that layer and make a black mask, change the color, and we want it to be a little bit lighter. So I'm just going to drag it up like so. Maybe even color pick it from the ref so it kind of matches up a bit more, because it's kind of like a different color, I guess. And kind of make it lighter. There we go. We can always change it with a HSL on top of the fill layer. And what we do is make a fill. And we're going to reference this mask right here, the mask that we just created. So let's see this. Cool. You can already visualize the color difference, but now it's just filling everything. What we want to do is just kind of have the outsides or the insides, whatever you want. So let's go ahead and add a filter and type in outline. We'll just basically take the outline from the mask. So let's go ahead and do this. And we don't want it to be on the outside. We kind of want it to be on the inside. Then you just want to change your threshold, change the width, and let's visualize it on the base color. As you can see here, we already have some breakup. Darker outsides and some lighter insides. And by doing these two things, it already kind of works. So if you want to tweak it, feel free to just change whatever here. Maybe the curve shape, drag it down just a bit, so you have a bit more breakup. And that's kind of how you get the insides to be a little bit lighter. And you've broken up the squiggly lines now. So go ahead and start painting in whatever. So if you paint in stuff here, it should already have like the lighter part to it as well. So don't worry about that. Everything is set up with the anchor points. So with only these couple of layers, we already have established a pretty decent base. So of course you would work on it a bit more and start adding the details that we already have. And up next, you can just add on dust with some generators like ambient occlusion. I'll just show one part, and then you can finish off the model and some details on it, and then we'll jump over to the metal part, which is underneath this painted layer. We have some chipped paint, for example. So just go ahead and start finishing up your model a little bit, add some more details here and there, some ambient occlusion, some dust, some hairs, and I'll see you back once that's done.